I've played a lot of Sonic games over the years, and of those games, the Sonic Adventure ones have always been some of my favorites. As a kid, I remember putting countless hours into Adventure 2 Battle on the GameCube and the shitty port of Adventure DX on the PS3. While I love both games to death, over the years I've flip-flopped over which one is my favorite, and I know I'm not alone on that front. Countless Sonic fans have debated over which of the two games is better for decades at this point, and it's easy to see why. Both games take a different approach to the same gameplay formula, so there's bound to be some kind of divide between the executions of both games. So I thought it would be fun to take a quick look at both games again and try and figure out which adventure game is my favorite. Despite being built off the same principles as the 2D games, the two adventure games have pretty different approaches to their stage design. The original Sonic Adventure goes for a more open, exploratory approach with its stages, with item boxes and shortcuts scattered throughout every nook and cranny. There's a lot of different ways you can approach each stage, with countless hidden pathways to take advantage of while racing towards the goal. This open nature often allows you to create your own shortcuts with a well-placed spin dash or jump, some of which end up feeling intentional since there's often item boxes tucked away in these side areas you normally wouldn't think to go to. This focus on exploration makes the stages feel more dynamic, and they feel like a perfect transition of the classic 2D stages into 3D. Adventure 2, meanwhile, leans into more linear stages, packed full of intense action set pieces. It still has its moments where you can explore for hidden goodies and power-ups, but they aren't as abundant or as intuitive as in SA1. The game makes up for that though with what I think is the best addition to the series, that being the ranking system. At the end of a stage, your score is accumulated and then given a ranking, ranging from E all the way to A. This adds a lot of depth and replayability to each stage, as now your goal isn't just about finishing each stage, but doing it while accumulating as many points as possible. Each stage is jammed packed with things that'll give you points, from hidden gold robots, flashy tricks off ramps, a secret route to get higher up on this rocket. There's a lot of things you need to consider if you want to nail the A rank. You know what, that was pretty awesome. The ranking system does a good job of extrinsically motivating the player to interact with the game's systems. SA1 does this to an extent with some of its extra missions, but its stages mostly thrive on an intrinsic appeal. While neither approach is objectively better than the other, I prefer SA2's ranking system. I like the sense of flow you can achieve in these stages as you chain together actions while flying towards the goal ring. It's like a high-speed obstacle course and it's always fun to blast through. In terms of control, Sonic Adventure 1 still has the best controlling Sonic in a 3D space to date. His movements are snappy, but still precise, which allows you to pull off some insane skips with a well-placed spin dash or jump. This lends to a Sonic that's easy to control while still encapsulating the intense speeds the character has become known for. Most of the time. Sonic can get a few upgrades over the course of the game, namely the Lightspeed Dash, which allows you to dash across a row of rings, and the Lightspeed Attack, which lets you home in on enemies. But they require you to stop in your tracks to charge up energy before you can use them. Well, that's not very light speed, is it? A lot of the times I find I can just spin dash jump over areas they want you to use the Lightspeed Dash, and I can only think of like 2 times you actually have to use the Lightspeed Attack. Once to open the door to Red Mountain, and you can also use it to get a quick kill on Chaos 6, but that's it. They're both pretty superfluous in the grand scheme of things, and it's a real pace breaker to have to stop and charge every time you're forced to use them. Other characters have more substantial upgrades, like Tails gets a swipe attack and a speed boost to his flight, Knuckles gets the ability to dig, and Gamma gets a glide and blaster upgrade. Amy and Big have upgrades that don't really do a lot either, but unlike Sonic's upgrades, they don't get in the way of general gameplay, mostly because you never have to use them. This is something that Adventure 2 improves on. The upgrades feel a lot more practical. The Lightspeed Dash is now instantaneous with the push of a button, and the new Bounce Bracelet allows you to gain air or quickly deal damage to enemies while maintaining your momentum. That's not to say the game doesn't have its more situational power-ups. The Flame Ring feels kind of unnecessary since it's only used to break specific types of boxes. The Lightspeed Attack is even more useless than in SA1, and the Mystic Melody is only really used for some optional missions. Otherwise though, the upgrades have seen a definite improvement, but in traditional Sonic fashion, he takes one step forward and a few steps back when it comes to control. Every move in this game is mapped to one action button. This is also true in SA1, but that game has less abilities, so it doesn't get in the way as often as it does here. Most of the abilities are context sensitive, but they can occasionally get in your way if you're just slightly off when activating them, like if you try to go in Light Dash but end up somersaulting instead. The new somersault move also introduces a tiny delay to activating the spin dash, which makes it feel worse than the SA1 spin dash. The window between the two is pretty tiny, so on paper it shouldn't really make a difference, but having to hold down the button for just that smidge longer has tripped me up more times than I care to admit. While this control scheme works in the context of Adventure 2, I think I prefer how Sonic controls in Adventure 1 more. Its simpler control scheme makes it easier to grasp, and it never feels like I'm fighting against the game like it does in Adventure 2 at times. These games featured playable characters other than Sonic, and each game tackles them pretty differently. In Adventure 1, each character is for the most part an extension of Sonic, with the only difference being their signature abilities. Tails has his flight, for example, and Knuckles can glide and dig for treasure. On their own, these characters are fun to play as, but my biggest issue with them is that they reuse a lot of the same stages. It's pretty easy to tell that most, if not all of these stages were made with Sonic in mind, so when you play them with the other characters, they feel like sort of a rehash. Tails' campaign is probably the most egregious with this. Since he spends most of it with Sonic, he ends up going to the same stages, but instead of giving him new level design in the same setting, you just race Sonic through his pre-existing stages. As a result, a lot of these stages are pretty short and don't really take advantage of Tails' unique moveset in an interesting way. They just kinda spam dash rings all over the place and called it a day. Thankfully, Knuckles gets a better treatment though. His levels are focused on exploring for emerald shards, so while his levels are still mostly the same as Sonic's, his moveset allows you to interact with them in a different way. Some stages like Casino Night even have whole new areas to explore that you can't access as Sonic. Amy is kind of a weird character. Her stages see her evading capture from Zero, an Eggman robot following her to capture a Flicky in her possession. Amy is a lot slower and clunkier than Sonic, which makes her a little more frustrating to play. Her stages aren't very long, but she's just not as fun to play as the other characters, so they end up dragging as a result. Gamma has a pretty cool campaign, since his gameplay style is way different than the other characters. His stages have a time limit, and by defeating enemies you can increase it in small increments. Unfortunately, he still runs into the same issue as a lot of the other characters. His stages are really short, so apart from Hot Shelter, which is a stage mostly unique to him, none of them really take advantage of his unique gameplay style, so his story ends before he can really get going. Big's story is, unique. It follows Big as he tries to find his friend Froggy by fishing. Sonic! Yeah, this one sucks. Shocking, I know. These stages are pretty short, but the fishing mechanics are really finicky, so actually catching Froggy can be more trouble than it's worth. It's the shortest story by far. I mean, you complete 10% of it just by watching his first cutscene, but it's easily my least favorite part of the game. The other characters in SA1 are kind of a mixed bag. While I have fun playing with a handful of them, the others just bring down the experience for me as a whole, and they're easily the part I look forward to the least whenever I replay this game. SA2 remedies this issue by lowering the amount of gameplay styles to just 3. The speed stages with Sonic and Shadow, the shooting stages with Tails and Eggman, and the treasure hunting stages with Knuckles and Rouge. The game is separated into 2 different campaigns that each follow a specific group of characters, and so they were able to give each character their own stages this time, even if the stages across both campaigns do share similar aesthetics here and there. The treasure hunting stages have been expanded, with larger open areas for Knuckles and Rouge to explore that take better advantage of their movesets. I like this change for the most part. There's a better hidden system to help you find the shards, and there's a lot more places the shards can be. The only downside is the Emerald radar has been limited to only tracking 1 shard at a time, which is a pain considering how much bigger these levels are. So you could fly over a piece 3 or 4 times and not notice it since it's not being tracked. Some of the levels near the end of the game are also massive, so not being able to track multiple shards at once makes them more frustrating than they need to be, as you climb the same areas over and over again looking for them. The shooting stages are a little more contentious. They're a lot clunkier than the ones in Adventure 1 and have a much greater emphasis on combat. Platforming can be a little bit finicky due to how clunky the mechs are, but it's also a lot simpler to compensate. It can be kind of annoying while playing these because the lock-on laser has this droning noise that plays every time you shoot something. It kinda sounds like a microwave now that I think about it. Maybe Tails is cooking a hot pocket while mercilessly slaughtering civilians. These stages have a different sort of appeal to the other playstyles, that being how many enemies you can chain together to get the highest score bonus. I still really like these stages, but they're definitely my least favorite of the 3 stage types. I think I prefer how SA2 handles its playable characters. While I like playing as the other characters in SA1 enough, they really pale in comparison to Sonic's campaign, so in a way I dread having to eventually play through the lesser ones when I'm done with Sonic. I like that each character in this game has their own unique levels. This approach lends itself to levels that take better advantage of each character's unique movesets and abilities. While some things like the shooting stages in the Emerald Radar aren't as good as they are in SA1, I think just about everything else was improved upon, and it makes SA2 a lot easier for me to go back to. Something I do miss from SA1 though is the adventure fields. These are little hub worlds that connect each of the stages, and they're absent in SA2 in favor of a more linear stage structure. These adventure fields have a lot of hidden goodies, from upgrades, emblems, chow eggs, and they more or less organically connect all of the levels together. There's also a bunch of NPCs around that have these little stories you can follow, like this girl who has a crush on the burger shop guy, or this walking nerd emoji that spews tutorials at you. Whoa, Mr. Sonic? Who knew Sonic was so popular with the ladies? These NPCs help the world feel more lived in, which is good since this was the first game to have such a focus on story. You know, it makes it feel more like an adventure. A Sonic adventure. The story of both games is simple, but they each have an insanely cheesy vibe and are super fun because of it. SA1's story follows Sonic as he tries to take down Dr. Eggman and his new partner Chaos, an ancient monster that gets stronger with each Chaos Emerald it absorbs. Most of the other characters are also a part of this basic narrative, but they have their own motivations and goals. Tails, for example, is working to prove himself and leave Sonic's shadow. Knuckles is searching for the shards of the Master Emerald after it's broken. Amy is protecting a Flucky she stumbled across, etc. Something that I like about SA1's story is its multiple perspectives. Since there's 6 playable characters in one linear story, sometimes scenes will appear in multiple scenarios, but with tiny differences. For example, in Tails' story, Eggman has a much more menacing vibe to portray how he sees Eggman as more of a threat than Sonic does. Sometimes you can even see other characters out in the adventure field while exploring. It helps the world feel more fleshed out, like it's one massive adventure you're only seeing one small part of at a time. SA2 has multiple scenarios too, but it was only limited to 2 this time. But I think that works here since the story is greater in scope than the first game. Like the moment you start Adventure 2, it's instantly clear what kind of vibe it's going for. And that energy doesn't let up for the entire game as it follows Sonic trying to stop Eggman and company from blowing up the Earth with the Space Colony arc. Things like Sonic and Tails storming the President's limo, Eggman blowing up the moon, to Team Sonic storming Eggman's pyramid base to steal his NASA spaceship. None of it makes any sense, but it somehow just works. It feels like an action movie in the best ways possible. This was also the first game to introduce Shadow, who to this day is the coolest character in fiction, so that's a few more points right there. When I think of stories in Sonic games, these are the first 2 games that come to mind. Hell, they're basing a whole movie off SA2, that's how awesome it is. I think it's neat seeing the evolution of the presentation between both games. Sonic Adventure was not only the first 3D Sonic game, but also the first to have a bigger focus on story, so it's a little rougher around the edges. A lot of the cutscenes and line deliveries are stilted, but they have this sort of charm to them as well. It doesn't ever really get in the way of the story the game is trying to tell. In a way, I think it even elevates it. The whole thing has this really cheesy, lighthearted vibe, with characters spewing one-liners and junk all over the place. It has this infectious 90s charm, and I can't get enough of it. When it comes to SA2's cutscenes, take everything I said about Adventure 1's vibe and dial it up to 11. There's a greater effort towards cinematic presentation here, with more dynamic camera angles and fluid character animation. A lot of the cutscenes are motion captured, which does make a few of the movements feel a little uncanny, but they're still a massive step up from the animations in SA1. Even some of the stuff like the really poor audio mixing and the characters talking over each other adds to this cheesy action movie vibe the game is going for. And it all culminates in one of the most iconic Sonic stories ever created. While there are some smaller things I could highlight from the 2 games, like the side content in the Chow Garden, they don't really have too much of an effect on my overall opinion. The original Sonic Adventure, in a way, is the perfect translation of the classic 2D games into the 3rd dimension. It has that classic focus on exploration, while also encouraging player experimentation through the openness of its stage design. It even takes a similar approach to its multiple characters, most of them being an extension of Sonic's base moveset. SA2 takes that formula and goes in a more linear direction, but leans heavier into the player expression aspect and rewards it through the addition of the ranking system, adding more variety to the different gameplay styles to help them stand out on their own merits. At the end of the day, I think I enjoy SA2 slightly more than its predecessor. While both games are extremely solid in their own right, SA2 is just a better overall experience for me. I find that whenever I go back to replay SA1, it's usually just the Sonic stages, and maybe the Tails and Knuckles ones if I'm feeling a little spicy before I call it a day. I feel ambivalent to the other characters, which isn't a feeling I have when I play SA2. SA2 is rough in some areas, especially in some of its later stages, but I find myself having a more consistently fun time when I replay it. I think what's so impressive about both games is just how much they're able to hold up even today. While they've definitely aged in a few areas, I still often see these two games topping a lot of fans' favorite game lists. The fact that they were able to make games that are still held in this high regard on their first and second attempts is pretty impressive. Both games are iconic, and did a lot to shape what many people believe the appeal of Sonic is. Even Sega thinks so, given how many times they've pulled from both games over the years. I think it just goes to show how important these games are to a lot of people. But which adventure game is your favorite? Let me know down in the comments and why. But no matter which one ends up being your favorite, I think we can all agree that neither of them holds a candle to the best 3D Sonic game. Sonic R, baby, let's go!